Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to span the range of the 33 through the 54th verse of Luke's 11th chapter. Herein we read of the light as a metaphor and what it means. We'll cover that when we cover it, and also of a confrontation as a guest at a Pharisee's home, in which he pronounces 6 woes. Woes are the opposites of blessings on his Pharisaical host, but we're just going to briefly review what we read. We've covered these in different lessons, pretty much all throughout. They're scattered, though, but chapter 11 begins with the what is commonly referred to as the Lord's Prayer, though for reasons I explain in Corey Johnston's John 17, the Lord's Prayer. I think it's better known as the Disciples' Prayer, but in Matthew's account, this comes in the sermon. This comes in response to a question in the Sermon of the Mount, so he tells his a little differently, but the formula is exactly the same. Start with your Father in heaven. His interest, the purpose of prayer is not to dictate our selfish desires, but to have his will known to us and for the courage to act as out. His name, his kingdom, his will, his interest. Then we ask for the things we need, our daily bread, our daily provisions. We also need forgiveness. We also need to forgive others in order to be forgiven, we read in Matthew's account. But finally, we are to close with a prayer for Satan in mind. The wicked one is a lot of English translations have gotten away from that, and I think it's tragic because wicked is not a thing. It is a personal. It has intensely personal qualities, just like as there is no love except that which exists between people, so too is evil an intensely personal force. It is embodied and exudes from the wicked one, that is Satan, and he has a heart that thinks, a mind that acts, and a will that follows, so that he has all the traits and characteristics of a person, and God holds him morally responsible, and you cannot hold anyone who is less than a person morally responsible. So we want to bear that in mind. Wicked is a personal force. It emanates from the evil or wicked one. And then he uses a parable and tells them, ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened to you. For everyone receives, and he who is seeking finds, and to him who is knocking it shall be opened. So this is a pretty strong promise, but there are conditions. This is not a blank slate to have any selfish desire we want. We have to pray with his will in mind and in the name of the Son, in the power of the Spirit. But, you know, if we do ask a righteous request, we will have the answer we seek, and he will let us know, and he may even grant our desire, our petitions to receive something. But that the guaranteed access is not guaranteed. That's just reading it at face value. Then he, the material is familiar from Matthew's 7th chapter, early verses 9 through 12 or something. Then we read of the famous confrontation where he is smeared as working. He is essentially called a tool of Satan because of his ability to cast out demons. The Pharisees say that the demon-possessed is a dumb person, and then he's able to speak, and the crowd is all amazed. But then there's some Pharisees in the crowd. Some of them said he cast out demons by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. So they're charging him with working. His power to cast out the demons is from his submission to Satan, and he says, are you kidding me? You know that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Satan is not divided. He is very relentless and very united. He has a kingdom, a complete control of his kingdom. So he would not attack his own. And then he says, when a strong man, having been well armed, watches over his own court, his possessions are in place. So this man had a demon in him. That's a superior entity, superior strength that was possessing him and controlling him and making him mute and dumb. It doesn't say the man was dumb. It says that the demon in the man was dumb, and the man by connection was made dumb by having that demon in them. But he is a superior force. So he goes out and, he says, this woman says, blessed, after he explains this, and, there's no line. about the illusion of neutrality. That's another one of Satan's lies. That's in Matthew 12:30. But in this account, we read that a certain woman from the crowd raised her voice and said, "Blessed is the womb who bore you, and the breast which nursed you out." But he said, "Blessed are those hearing the word of Yahweh and keeping it." So the blessing is not biological connection to him. These people are mere mortals. They're humans, as was he, but he was still fully divine. And then this crowd, they demand a miracle. The Jews were spoiled brats with the miracles, and so they demanded to see a sign as a confirmation that he was who he says he was. He promised them one thing. He calls them a wicked and adulterous generation, and he tells them that there's only one sign, the sign of the prophet Jonah. And no one knows what that means, and we wouldn't even know what that means unless it was with the gift of hindsight from the resurrection. As Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of a fish, so too would the Messiah spend 3 days in the ground under the grave and then rise on the third. But he says that they're going to be condemned at the judgment by the men of Nineveh who heard and repented to his preaching, and also the queen of the south, that's the queen of Sheba, who traveled the distance of some 1,000 miles from the modern country of Yemen all the way up the Arabian Peninsula just to see and hear and learn from this man. They had a greater than Solomon, a wiser in their midst, and that does not look well for them because they had the access to him. They had the prophecies, and the prophets are going to come up in our discussion, but we're going to get open with the 33rd verse. The first 4 verses pertain to the metaphor of the light, and we're going to connect the two as we delve into the second. "And no one, when he has lit a lamp, puts it in a hidden place or under a basket, but on a lampstand, that those who come in shall see the light." So if you have a lamp and it's lit, you're not going to suppress it under the bed. You're not going to put a cloth over it. You're going to have it open and visible and accessible to shine its light, else it is useless. And so the light exists to be seen and to guide, and it is by that light that your guests can see in the home. These would have been candles and lamps in the ancient world. But the obvious point is you do not conceal the light, because if you conceal it, there's going to be no light to bask in. "The lamp of the body is the eye. Therefore, when your eye is good, your body also is enlightened. But when your eye is evil, your body also is darkened." So the lamp is the metaphor for the eye, because our eyes are what enables us to perceive and absorb light. So those are the organs which, they have virtuous and viceful potential, but that is wholly contingent on what we put in front of our eyes. And our eyes will follow what it wants to follow. If it can be either good or wicked, and that's going to determine a lot, because our eyes, what we fixate our eyes on, what we look at, what we dwell on. The Savior said, if a man even looks at a woman with lust, he has committed adultery in your eye. So the evil potential is connected to John, the Apostle's first epistle, 2nd chapter, 16th verse, the lust of the eyes. That is the negative potential of the eyes to follow. And so you basically spend your life looking for, women you want to undress with your eyes, and that is evil. "See to it, therefore, that the light which is in you is not darkness." So darkness is deceptive, and by its very deceptive nature, it can convince those who are walking in it that they are walking in light. Little do they know, because the darkness conceals the actual light. There's no such thing as darkness. There's only a lack of light. So darkness has no force in itself, at least, but the light is the force. So the light is the good, and that is metaphorical and analogous to goodness and all other synonyms of the same, whereas darkness is attributed to evil. "And if all your body is enlightened, having no part dark, all shall be enlightened, as when the bright shining of a lamp gives you light." So as it's similar with the literal lamp, so too is it going to be with the body. If you surround yourself with light, if you recognize the light for what it is, if you are a child of light, you will gravitate to the light, and you will know it for it was. You will not mistake the darkness for the light, as the Gentiles and the sinners do. So having that lamp within you means that you're able to receive and reflect light. So that's who we are as disciples. He calls us to be the light of the world, a city on a hill that cannot be hid. So we have to make our witness and proclamations public and known in order for us to call ourselves disciples. And as he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went and sat down to eat. Now the Pharisees, by this time, they were dead set against him. They were determined to trap him. Now, if this Pharisee was genuine and sincere, he would have pulled him aside for private conversation. But the dinner would have been in the company of fellow Pharisees, and they were trying to get him to say something according to which they could indict him according to either their own or Roman law. And so this wasn't a friendly invitation, but he accepted nonetheless because he had a point to prove, and that point was to pronounce the 6 woes on the Pharisees. They thought they were blessed. He had a different diagnosis for their condition. And when the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he did not wash before the dinner. So this also we read of in Mark's 9th chapter and Matthew's 15th, the famous confrontation about food, and it leads into something similar here. It's not what goes in the man, but what comes out of the man that makes him evil and defiled. So the Pharisees had an external orientation to measuring and assessing their religion and everyone else and everything else. But, this Pharisee was astonished, so he had his trap. He had his thing to be offended about, and he could tell. He didn't have to say anything. He could read his mind. And the master said to him, "Now you Pharisees make the outside of the cup and dish clean, but your inward part is filled with greed and wickedness." So what they were doing by cleaning the outside, their hands, everything else, they were masking the fact that inside them dwelled greed and wickedness. Greed, they didn't dress in fancy clothes, but they accumulated money. They had powers of prestige and influence at the synagogue level. And, one of the things they kept their mass audience yoked to their bondage was through legalistic observances. And legalistics tend to be externally oriented in their approach and outlook to acts and deeds and just about everything else. So they're ignoring within them. It's not what you do on the outside that counts. It's your inner condition that is going to be judged at the judgment. Mindless ones, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? So that's foolish in most translation, but I actually kind of like this one. Mindless, that just means they are really stupid. It goes above and beyond mere fool. I actually like this one. But the question that he asks is rhetorical and self-evident. The one, did he, that's capitalized, so that's his Father in heaven. He made the outside and he made the inside, and because he made the inside, he can see in the inside. He has subterranean insight, which can dissect the motives and orientations and characteristics and character and outlooks of the heart and our spirits and our internal beings. But give in kindness of that which is within, and see all are clean to you. So, he's telling them, don't, give in kindness. That means be generous, but not only generous, but willfully so. They made a big fuss about the fact that they tithed, but they weren't generous to the man on the street or anything. And, what they thought was clean was quite clearly not clean. He alludes to a more exalted definition of defiled and clean, which constitutes which. But woe to you Pharisees, because you tithe the mint and rue the every plant and pass by the justice and love of Elohim. These you should have done without leaving the others undone. So he just gives them their report card. This is the first of his 6 woes. Remember, woe is the opposite of a blessing. It is a cursing to come. And, they tithed. That was measurable. It has a quantifiable aspect that is easily measured and easily fits into the mindset of a legalist. And, they tithe not only their money, but every plant, everything they grew. but they neglected to heed the weightier matters, the justice and love. They were without love, and Paul says all other spiritual gifts and exercises without love are as clanging cymbals. So that's who these Pharisees were. They put on a big show and big publicity hounds, but at the end of the day, they were lost in their sin, and they were loving it, and they were the blind leading the blind. And he's telling them these are the things you should have done, but if you could take it back, you may as well not do the tithing, because it's better to not tithe without love in your heart, with love in your heart, than it is to tithe with hatred in your heart. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the best seats in the synagogues and the greetings in the marketplace. So this is one of the privileges of their advantage positions at the synagogue level. They were afforded the best seats in the synagogue. They were top of the table and front and center, and the best seats in the house. And the greetings would have been similar to the way we call a judge your honor. So it is just a title of respect that they are accustomed to receiving as a result of their vocation in the marketplace. And that was one of their motivations for doing what they did, was to be acclaimed and adulated by those they saw in the marketplace. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you are like the unseen tombs, and the men walking over them do not know. So that's the third woe. This he includes the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes mostly were Pharisees, but they were the legal authors and interpreters and doctors and scholars and everything else. So most of them were Pharisees, but more important than that is they were hypocrites. They did the right things with the wrong motives, and they were adept in the vice which pays virtue homage, which is hypocrisy, which is not uncommon amongst religious people. But the unseen tombs, this would have been a whitewashed tomb. See, the Jews were very icky-picky about touching the dead and graves and everything else, so they would whitewash tombs to preserve their external ceremonial purity. But the Pharisees would... They were living as unseen tombs. They were whitewashed tombs. They were defiling everyone they touched. They were not helping them. They were harming them. And one of those learned in the Torah answering said to him, Teacher, when you say this, you insult us too. So he's interrupted this. I personally mark my Bible. This is by hand, but I underlined the things in red that the Messiah ends. This is one in the audience. So the red ink ends, and he's telling him that you insult us too. So even though he did address the host Pharisee in the plural, woe to you, Pharisees and scribes. They think it's, they're taking it personal too, and they're just letting him know that. But what he was saying to them was tough love. And he said, Woe to you also, you learned in the Torah, because you load men with burdens hard to bear, and you yourself do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. So this is the fourth woe, and the ones learned in the Torah would have been the scribes and the scholarships. Now, it was, but the Bible interpretation shouldn't be an aristocracy. It should be a democracy. We should have every believer in every church reading this book for themselves daily and figuring out their own answers. It's not, you don't need we can appreciate and admire scholarship, but the layperson doesn't really need that. We kind of do, but so just to return to the passage itself, legalism, it imposes a large burden on the legalistic observer, but the problem is that they are unable to lift the burdens because they are so burdened by the dread of ceremonial defilement that they would not help a half-beaten man by the roadside, such as we witness, for instance, in the 10th chapter of this book, the Good Samaritan parable. That's because they were so concerned about the priest and the Levite who walked right by this man were so concerned about defiling themselves ceremonially that they could not do the job they were doing. But that's a different story. Woe to you, because you build the tombs of the prophets, and your fathers killed them. So the Pharisees were a post-prophetic movement. The final prophet in the Jewish Old Testament was Malachi, who wrote around 432. The Pharisees did not emerge until the the Hellenistic culture reigned supreme, and they were in the process and business of Hellenizing their subject people, introducing their culture, and a lot of Jews were getting swallowed up in them. So the Pharisees emerged and said, we are going to be separate from that. That's what Pharisees originally translates as separatist. But they so they started with a good motive, and they actually exalted. The Pharisees were distinct from the Sadducees in that they considered the writings of the prophets canonical. And so they had all the prophets, they swore by them, they studied them night and day, left and right, yet they somehow missed the fulfillment of those prophecies in their midst. So he says that they are just like their fathers who would have killed the prophets, because you are in the midst of, and you are determined to kill me right now. So you bear witness that you approve of the works of your fathers, because they indeed killed them, and you build their tombs. So they're building their tombs and, making their halos, but their fathers had killed them, and they are no different from their fathers. The truest test of this was that here was a prophet and more than a prophet in their midst. So before John the Baptist burst on the scene, Israel hadn't seen or heard of a prophet in some 400 years, or a little over, actually. About 460. And because of the wisdom of Elohim said, I shall send them prophets and apostles, and some of them shall kill. They shall kill and persecute. Now, this is not an Old Testament scripture. The dead giveaway is the apostle. The term actually does not emerge more fully until the book of Acts. I guess it's a term in here. But this is, remember that Yahshua is the Son. He has intimate and total, complete, close access to his Father in heaven. So this word comes from him, and he tells them that, what was true with the Jewish people in the Old Testament is true with the New. They kill and persecute the ones they don't kill, of those who are sent for their very behalves. They just receive them and reject them. So that the blood of all the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the world shall be required of this generation. The blood of all the prophets since the foundation of the world. That means everyone who ever lived, everyone who has ever borne the martyr's crown or embraced the martyr's call, and the earliest one of which is Abel and Zechariah. We meet of these two in the next verse, but he's calling all the blood that was shed from him to him and beyond to be answered to. This generation has to answer for it, his present company included. From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple. Yes, I say to you, it shall be required of this generation. So Abel is the second human being ever born as far as is listed in the Genesis account. We actually don't know that, but he was the younger born whose older brother Cain was a farmer and he was a shepherd. So when it came time to offer Yahweh a sacrifice, Abel's was pleasing and Cain's was rejected, and Cain grew envious at his brother and conspired to kill him in open blood. That makes Abel the first martyr of the faith, because he was in Yahweh's cause for what he was killed for. And Zechariah, now the Jews, they arrange their Old Testament a little differently than ours. They have the law, the prophets, and then the writings. So Chronicles, even though we classify it as historical book and place it accordingly just before the writings, it actually appears at the tail end of their Old Testament. And so in the 24th chapter of the second book by that name, we read of Zechariah, who was the final recorded martyr in Scripture from the Jewish Old Testament vantage point. But once more, he says that it shall be required of this generation. So all the blood, everyone that's ever been shed, all that is on you. That is this pretty serious statement. Woe to you, learned in the Torah, because you took away the key of knowledge, and you did not enter in yourselves, and those who were entering in you hindered. So I actually lost track of the woes. This might be the sixth and final one, but learned in the Torah, we've read that phrase before. That would have been the scribes, the educated, the scholarly, and for all their scholarship, they did not know the key to knowledge. They had it, but they squandered it. They invented their own religion in response to the true religion. They added additional burdens and legalistic injunctions, and in so doing took the key away from knowledge, because they were missing the whole point. They were neglecting the justice and love, and following just the minutia of details, and they thought they were, gaining their access to their heavenly homeland. But not only were they not, but they were the blind leading the blind, others astray. So those who took them seriously and latched onto them to learn would inherit their doomed fate, and that entails serious consequences. So we who teach carry an awful burden with tremendous responsibility and consequences for failing in that duty. It is not something I would be doing unless I was assured I was doing it right. And as he was saying to them, the scribes and the Pharisees began to oppose him fiercely and to draw him out on many subjects. So we heard his turn, and we don't read much of the Pharisees, but we do read that there is many subjects, so we don't know what those subjects were, but they had not gotten the point. These were fighting words for them, even though he would have successfully silenced him. They just did not get the message. They were determined to trap him. They were bloodthirsty. They were fiercely opposing him, and this was all for the purpose of, which completes the sentence, verse 54, watching him and seeking to catch somewhat from his mouth, so as to accuse him. So their eyes were on him. They were attentively and diligently observing him, not only what he said and what he did, but also what he said on top of what he did. I misspoke earlier, but they were hoping to catch him saying some doubtful utterance of reproach, according to which they could accuse him, charge him, arrest him, and ultimately crucify him. And they got what they want, but his hour was not yet. But the bloodthirst and the motivation was always there for the Pharisees to have this man crucified. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.